So hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Scooting to Healthy and Safe Mode Choices. My name is John MacArthur. I am the Sustainable Transportation Program Manager at Portland State's Transportation Research and Education Center, better known as TREC. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation Communities, a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Arizona, University of Oregon, University of Texas at Arlington, and the Oregon Institute of Technology. NITC's research priorities is improving mobility of people and goods to build a strong communities. Our presenters today are myself, and I'm kind of co-leading here and also acting as the introduction person, sorry. Other presenters are Christy Kearns and Nicole Iroz-Elardo, and I will introduce them right now. So Kristi is an assistant professor in the College of Architecture and Planning and let me say that again, in the College of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture at the University of Arizona in Tucson. She studies the intersection between transportation and land use development. Her current research and teaching emphasizes the rethinking and redeveloping new data and methods for applications in practice to help communities plan for the places they want. Nicole is a new assistant professor of public health at Willamette University. Cross-trained in planning and public health, her research focuses on how to plan healthier and more equitable communities. And finally, myself, I'm active in research related to sustainable and equitable transportation, particularly in areas of emerging tech such as e-bikes, bike share, transit, and relationships between transportation and public health. Our next NITC webinar is on July 12th, Friday, at 10 a.m. to 11 p.m. Pacific. The title is Assessing Economic Impact of Disaster-Induced Transportation Disruptions Using a University Community Partnership Framework. And it's going to be presented by Divya Chandrasekhar from the University of Utah. So this presentation will be about 40 minutes long. Then we will have 15 minutes to answer your questions. During the presentation, please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. So as you see down here, not in the chat, but you will see a Q&A and you can type your questions in there. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of professional development credit through AICP, continuing education credit. For other continuing credit, education credit, we provide an electronic attendance certificate on the webinar webpage, which we will share in the chat, that link. That is the professional development certificate credit link. And then if you are interested in upcoming webinars, seminars, and trainings, please go to our event page. We will post these into the chat too during the presentation here. All right, so I'm going to be up first in this webinar. And I'm going to switch over to my other slides here. All right. So I'm going to be first talking about the perspectives on e-scooter use. And so this is a kind of multi-year, multi-sectional approach to understanding the travel behaviors of e-scooters in Portland, Oregon. I want to first point out the co-authors on this project, Minju, Nicholas, and Jennifer, who are definitely kind of part of this big team that we're kind of looking at this survey data. And then special thanks to our partners at the City of Portland Transportation, Bureau of Transportation, particularly Jacob Sherman, and then the other entities that helped share and administer the surveys. So one of our kind of research questions here that we were looking at was, how are e-scooters being used in Portland, Oregon during the first few years of our kind of e-scooter pilots that we've had in Portland starting in 2018, and then over the next couple of years leading up to COVID. And we'll be talking a little bit about the effects of COVID on e-scooter travel a little bit later. But really another research question is like, how to do these shared micromobility kind of options? How are they a alternative mode in the future to help reach city policy goals? And finally, what is the impact on travel behavior? So a little, background is, obviously, shared scooter systems came, into cities 2016, 2017, started to really accelerate in the 18, 19, and became a thing, right? And so we wanted to see how these were affecting travel, and particularly around mode shift and from private vehicle usage, but also this kind of goal which the city has is to enhance first and last mile connections to transit, and then to meet these goals of mobility, climate, and equity goals that the city has. So the city has a great website. I will definitely suggest pointing this out if you are wanting to get into what is going on at the city. They have a couple reports about scooter usage here. They also have a new kind of website. It just launched around collecting all the trips, and here's a map of showing a heat map of where all those trips are happening. So this is a collected data set, but you can kind of see that there was a total trips per year. It really hit a peak there in 2019, a little fall off in 2020, and then obviously a major fall off that happened with COVID. But as things are coming back, we're seeing scooter trips coming up back into use. In general, we're looking at under a mile per trip, taking about 10 minutes, but 2,000 trips a day, and as you can see, a lot of miles ridden in the city of Portland over those years. So the methods that we are looking at in our project here is PBOT had ridership surveys that they did in 2018, 19, and 20. That's our main data for the study. The two 2018 and 2019 surveys were collected in September and October of those years. The 2020 was collected actually right before COVID had February and March. So kind of another snapshot, a different time period. And they really, we took all the data. We pulled out the people that lived and or worked in Portland to focus on this data set. And, and you can see the data responses here for each of the years, 2018, 19, and 20. So demographics, who are these respondents? Well, they're slightly younger than the population in Portland, probably more than slightly younger, so about 50% between 18 and 35 years of age. Slightly higher income than the population, but not much. More likely to be male, so 60 to 67%, depending on the years, so it's changed a little bit. And then generally matching the population for race and ethnicity. But still, it is Portland, about 75% of the respondents were white. So one of the first questions when we're talking about travel mode before using an e-scooter, how do people get around? And you can see basically that, in general, these are not folks that use biking and Bike Town, which is our bike share program, to get around. In general, more than a couple times a week, people drove, walked, and used transit for their trips. And with some kind of mixed transit use depending on the individual. But since using the scooter, how had their travel options changed? And, in general, a lot of it was remaining the same, though we do see some, self-reporting around driving alone, taxis, and rideshare of reduction, less often used, those type of modes for traveling. And I will say, I just want to, I'm presenting some, initial research. We're still writing a paper that we hope to get finished here this month, and we're doing some modeling and some more extensive data analysis. But I'm kind of giving you an overview of the survey results right now. So trip purpose, we see these 3 different years. We can see how in the initial pilot stages that the use of fun and recreation was the primary trip purpose of getting on a scooter, with work and being second. I've kind of color coded these kind of work, as work and school as being, the same type of kind of commute trips. Yellow, this kind of orange color being utilitarian trips, and transit, connection to transit, because that's a important goal of or hope that transit, the scooters will do, is connect people to transit as being a green. But you do see in 2020 that there's a reduction in that fun recreation, and a little bit of a bump if work trips, so people are using them to get to work. This is the primary trip purpose by the demographic groups that we've used, and you will see, there's some similarities. We do I think some of the bigger differences to just point out is particularly around people, that how they used it and how they thought about using it. So if they were a less frequency user versus a daily user, what they were using those trips for, what were they using the scooter for. So work and utilitarian trips were, very much used by daily users. But in general, you see that this is all the years aggregate, that, transit trips only make up about 7% of connecting to transit trips, only makes up 7%. But this is, kind of a little dissecting it a little deeper here by race and frequency user over the years, so you can see a difference between 2018 and 2020. And we do see for, both white and BIPOC individuals that there is an increase in utilitarian and workday trips, or work and school, trips. And certainly for frequency of users, we see that increase even for weekly users, so that as they are becoming more comfortable, they're using it more often for maybe a variety of different trips, not just the initial, hey, fun, let's use this to get around, let's try it out. But also, I think, just wanted to point out is that 2020, the daily users went up to about 15% to connect to transit. So that's maybe a little highlight there to look at. So one of the other questions was options to encourage more scooter use. So we'll talk a little bit this, as we kind of listen to all 3 presentations, is how do we get more people to use micromobility and shared micromobility? And across the board, the 2 highest ones, depending on the demographics or type of user, more safe places to ride. So I think, there is a misconception of that, people are using sidewalks because it's easier or whatever. It's because they want more. They want more places to ride safely. They want to feel safe while they're riding. The other one is, more scooter availability and lower costs. To get more people to use the system more often is, have, walk out the door, there'll be a scooter there, but also to reduce those costs. So basically some, kind of general results here. As I said, we're compiling this stuff for a journal article that we hope to have done this month with some more complex data analysis and modeling here. But in general, demographics, we see, higher income riders, and with weekly riders, their trips are taking more trips. And for frequency of use, the percent of users who use it only once, went down, but the people that occasionally or less than once a week during that 2018 to 2020 went up. So we're seeing more frequency. The motivation of the first time riding changed from curious to fun to convenience. So the people are becoming more kind of aware and used to this new option here, a switch to more utilitarian trips. And then also we're seeing some around that mode substitution. So again, scooters tend to substitute walking a lot over the years, but we did see a reduction in driving and use of taxis. So people are not using a vehicle to make those short trips. So one of the things when cities are thinking about why they want micromobility and shared micromobility is maybe to reduce some of those short trips that people were using a vehicle to use. And so for discussions, e-scooters are shifting from a novelty to a recreational vehicle. Many women, whites, older people, and low frequency riders are replacing walking trips. Again, talking about frequency in utilitarian trips, changes. Lastly, for conclusions, one of the things I think is kind of interesting here is that, non-bike share riders view e-scooters as maybe a bridge. So those people that were using e-scooters were not using the bike share system, which we have here in Portland. So that might be encouraging people to use that were never going to use bike share or not interested in using bike share to use a more kind of sustainable micromobility mode. I certainly think there needs to be more done to encourage young white men, non-young white men demographics to participate in this. So how do we get more women, BIPOC, and older adults using these devices? Part of it is a form factor, getting more seated scooters, maybe diversifying the where the scooters are, and creating more safe places to ride. So that said, that includes my presentation. Next up is Christy Kearns, and I'll stop sharing and let Christy take over.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. Okay. Get my slides in order. So if it wasn't clear in the beginning, one of the things we're doing in this webinar is we're talking about 3 different studies that are related, that have ties, but they are distinctly different studies. And so this is the second study that we're looking at, and John MacArthur is on our TAC committee. We have some relationships between how we've been thinking and talking about these things, but it is a separate study. So I want to give credit to all of the participants and co-authors and TAC members of this separate study. This study was really focused in Tucson, Arizona, and Salt Lake City, Utah. So slightly different environments than Portland, but we do have some comparisons with Portland. So in this study, we really focused on 2 broad questions. The first was really about whether these micromobility options, specifically e-scooters, how they're synergistic, substitutive, or complementary to conventional options that are available. And then with those users, how are they using e-scooters across different facilities. So we approached this project with two different components to our study. We did a user survey with the city of Tucson in the fall 2019. So this was right before the pandemic. And then we also did some observations in Salt Lake City in the summer and spring of 2021. And I mentioned that specifically because that is somewhat of an important note. This project, like I think all the projects we're talking about here, all started before the pandemic. We collected some data, we did some of that work, and then we had to postpone a lot of the data collections that we were doing. What those implications are in the pandemic and the disruption that we've all observed in many different ways in our activities and our travel, I think we're still learning from that. But I think it's an important caveat to bring up for this study and for others like it. I also wanted to point out that I'm just going to talk about some of the high-level findings from our report, but it's a large document. There's a lot of details about the data, the analysis, and some of the implications. And there are two pieces that I think some of you might be interested in based on a browse of the participant list. We have a chapter that's a review of agency requirements around shared e-scooter programs that Julian Griffey led as part of the TRB Minority Fellows program. So that's an entire chapter. That's 2019. I think it was done in summer 2019. And then we also have 2 or 3 appendices that summarize some observations we did in Tucson, which were piloting some of the observations we did in Salt Lake City. So although I'm not going to talk about them, we have some data that we had captured about parked e-scooters and e-scooter users in Tucson in, I think, late 2019 that might be relevant for all of you watching. So one of the big themes that I'm personally interested in is how e-scooters disrupt mode behavior, specifically related to mode substitutions, complements, and synergies. So just at a high level, John was talking a lot about substitutions. I'm also interested in complements and synergies. So complements, substitutes would be substituting a vehicle trip for an e-scooter trip. Complements might be opportunities in where e-scooters might encourage or help facilitate existing transportation modes. And synergies is a more vague concept where e-scooters might actually encourage more types of trips and more types of activities in other ways because it enables more access, which is a much harder thing to capture because the alternative are trips not taken, and that's a difficult thing to capture. The implications, as Nicole will talk about them in her presentation, range from things like reducing greenhouse gas reduction, reducing auto dependency, to public health outcomes like increasing or lowering physical activity and increasing destination access, so enabling activities that would not otherwise have been able to occur. Just some comparisons. I pulled some of the original data from Portland studies, some of which John talked about earlier from 2018, and also a study of Roslyn, Virginia from 2019. Tucson's data was collected in fall 2019, so this is a little bit more comparable to maybe data today, which might be different. Behavior has changed in the past 2 years. We're just not sure how. And we'll notice that when we look across Tucson, we start to see some really big differences in how or which kinds of modes e-scooter trips were substituting for. In Tucson, we see much higher rates of substitution with personal vehicle. We tend to have higher rates of vehicle use in general, but lower rates of ride-hailing services. We tend to have lower rates of ride-hailing services in general. One really notable difference is in both Portland and Roslyn, Virginia. So Portland, Oregon, Roslyn, Virginia, outside of Arlington and DC, had much higher substitution rates for walking, whereas we didn't quite see that in Tucson. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tucson, even in the fall, it can be 90, 95 degrees. I seem to remember that fall was a particularly warm one, but that's just my memory, not being able to tolerate the heat all that well. We saw a lot more substitutive rates with personal biking trips. Biking is really popular in Tucson. It's relatively flat. It's really lovely 9 months out of the year. So it makes sense that we might see higher rates of substitution for biking, particularly where long distance walking is not as common. We saw lower rates of public transit substitution, which is often a concern because we often talk about it as a competitive mode, e-scooters and public transit. But I think Tucson and our environment in Tucson enables something slightly different. And then similar to Portland, we did see a little less than 10% of new trips that would not have been taken without e-scooter, which means that these are new activities that are being generated. That also means new energy use, but also potentially new opportunities. In general, we asked a lot of questions about why people are taking certain modes, specifically related to e-scooters. Predominantly, that it was just fun, it was novelty, is fairly high. So in fall 2019, we had our e-scooter pilot going for about 5 months when this was deployed. So that novelty was still pretty high at the time. But we also saw quite a few responses about parking being difficult. So in some of our downtown commercial cores, parking is more challenging. So it is almost easier to bike or to take e-scooters. And then we also saw a number of people who didn't have another option, or they didn't want to get sweaty where they were going, which is a really relevant one here in Tucson throughout the year because it gets so hot. In general, what we did is we took some mode substitution questions. We asked, based on the last trip, thinking about the last trip, what would you have taken? And we related it to a number of demographic options, alternative mode availability options, and trip purposes to get a sense of how the mode substitutions are related to things like demographics. In terms of demographics, age and income were two of the more significant demographic notes that were correlated. I don't believe gender came into it, even though similar to Portland, we did have higher rates of male ridership reported. In general, what we're seeing is that there's less likely substitutions for higher income or older individuals where it's less likely that they are taking active modes in transit in general. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tucson, the university makes up a substantial core of our employment, and it's also a key center close to our downtown and connected by commercial corridors. So it's not surprising that for those who have workable bikes and transit passes and things like that, we're seeing a higher likelihood of replacing active and transit trips. I do think it's worth noting that for those that have a parking pass for their employer, we are seeing a more likely replacement of active travel and a less likely replacement of personal vehicle trips. So if you have that parking pass for work, you're much more likely to keep using that and use e-scooters as a supplement or to replace active trips. So that's controlling for demographics, for example. Similarly, we have a whole series of regressions, and the rates and all the background information is available in the report. I just want to cover some of the key relationships. In these analyses that we looked at, we're really just looking at whether different trip purposes are related at more or less likely to replace different types of trips. So in the category of the use of an e-scooter is generating a new trip, we saw really positive relationships between for trips that are going to school and going to restaurants. So that means that if you're listing a trip purpose of going to school or going to restaurants, you're more likely to have generated a new trip. As a faculty who teaches, I think it's fantastic that that means that these students may not have gone to campus to go to school had the e-scooter not been available. That's pretty significant. As business owners might be interested, the more likely to generate a new trip to go to restaurants means that those restaurant activities would not have happened had e-scooters not been available. Another really significant finding in my mind is that the e-scooter was more likely to replace a transit trip to get to other types of transit. To me, this is a complementary use. It means that e-scooters are being used to help fill in some of those gaps in transit to facilitate more frequent transit use. And that was a pretty high likelihood difference. So there's a whole lot of regressions and analysis that you can look at too that are summarized in plain English in the report. But I think that those are two really significant examples of how e-scooters can generate new activity or replace trips. Similarly, if you have these sort of fun activities, sightseeing, shopping errands that you're doing, you are less likely to replace active travel with those trips for the e-scooter. So you're more likely to maybe replace your personal vehicle or when you're going to school or when you're going to some of those activities. So we also asked a series of questions related to whether or not people experienced crashes that we related to demographics and other types of characteristics of how people are riding. We noted that more than half preferred to ride downtown, a quarter preferred to ride with other users, so it was more of a social activity, and a fair number really prefer to ride during the daytime and not during night, early mornings, or the evening. And we asked a whole series of questions to sort of get a sense of how people prefer to cross the street. Do they prefer to ride with auto traffic or bikes or on sidewalks and so on? Two of the more important ones in my mind are this sort of differentiation between whether people prefer to ride on sidewalks or in the street. One of the findings we found is that people who stated that they prefer riding on sidewalks were 150% more likely to have reported getting into a crash of some sort. So there's clearly some tension with where riders feel safe riding, and then what that means in terms of crashes, which I believe Nicole will get to more specifically. This brings us to sort of our second piece of the study, which was looking more holistically at how people are riding in practice. So in everything I've talked about so far, it's really stated preferences. People are taking a survey and sort of explaining what they prefer. We also wanted to ask whether or not infrastructure, specific built environment infrastructure, influences rates at which people are doing things like riding on the sidewalk. So we wanted to know whether bike lanes correspond with preferred riding behaviors in areas around rail transit, and whether the presence of rail transit corresponds with higher rates of things like sidewalk riding, violating signals, things like that with and without bike lanes. And lastly, we really, in Tucson, we have quite a few very large facilities, 6 to 8 lanes of traffic. And we wanted to understand whether, even when we have things like bike lanes or not bike lanes, whether larger facilities correspond with improved rates of these kind of micro decisions made in practice, like riding the sidewalk. So to do this, we set up a paired analysis. So we looked at observations at different intersections that were very similar, except one had bike lanes, very similar, except one had rail transit. And we observed these behaviors. We looked in the literature for examples of how to classify them. We observed them, and then we compared the outcomes across these different infrastructure pairs. Our University of Utah collaborators were instrumental in this. They led this effort, Reed Ewing, Dong Ah Choi, and Brendan Syracuse, and their chapter in our report is really fantastic. It really lays out a lot of the background and why we're looking at things this way. We had identified a huge number of things that we believed we could observe without asking specific questions, and we did look across different modes, but it's important to realize that we're really not comparing across modes, because those kinds of observable behaviors are not comparable in a consistent way. So what we were really interested in is whether the infrastructure itself and the way in which we're providing those facilities influences or nudges people to behave in different ways in different parts of the city. So for scooter users, the big things we really collected were riding on sidewalks, signal violation, and things like helmet use, which are all sort of sticking points in a lot of the public discourse down here and in other cities. In some of our findings, we did find that there's less riding on sidewalks when bike lanes are available. But when you have rail transit like light rail or larger 6-lane facilities, statistically, we're seeing similar rates of riding on the sidewalk. I think this is really important because it means that bike lanes are fantastic, but when you have more complex intersections louder, larger facilities, faster or light rail, potentially more dangerous facilities. People are still riding more on the sidewalk, even if those bike lanes are present. In terms of traffic signal violations, we saw less violations at intersections with bike lanes, but also less at larger intersections. There seemed to be an effect of the more complex infrastructure in compliance of things like, so less jumping the red light to get across the intersection, possibly because those intersections are just much, much bigger. And lastly, we did collect some information on whether we could observe distracted behaviors. So in the literature, that's usually classified as like listening to headphones or talking on your phone. And we did see more of those behaviors on facilities with bike lanes. But we do believe that there's something related to how safe people feel. And we saw much lower rates on larger facilities, much lower rates near light rail transit, which we think has some correlation with perceptions of risk in those areas. But again, even if you're listening to headphones, it doesn't mean that you're distracted. Those types of things can't be purely observed. So these are just observation-based notes. And the last few caveats that I'll give before passing this off to Nicole is that, with our survey data, that's really stated use. With our observations, we're really limiting to sort of one mode comparisons of how the modal behaviors vary across different facility types. So we really don't believe that you can make cross-mode comparisons, and we're not trying to do that in this analysis at all. And the last thing that I'll leave you with is that in our Tucson survey, more than about 20 people stated that they at least sometimes use a helmet. But when we did our observations in Tucson, we saw only 2%. And in Salt Lake City, we saw only 2%. So there seems to be a real disconnect between using helmet use and how frequently people are thinking they're using. But I will leave some of those notes to Nicole, who will talk about the public health implications of this kind of work.
All right, thank you, Christy. So let me get my screen shared. Looks like it is this one. Ta-da! All right, so I'm going to take you guys through some of the public health implications of this. And this is even a smaller pot of money that's divided into two different kind of sub areas. And Christy really helped on the first, but I also want to thank our partners at the City of Tucson, Andy and Krista, and then Brendan Haggerty at Multnomah County. If he didn't do this, most of this would not be possible. So, all right, so my major question is this, like, are e-scooters healthy? And we have this about a lot of the non-vehicular modes that are out there and options that are out there right now. And in particular, I wanted to conceptualize, start thinking about what we would need to know to be able to analyze more than safety. The first question that's always out of the gate is, are they safe? But we know that safety is just a small portion of the public health drag or benefit from our transportation systems. So that's where I started from. But along the way, that safety thing kept popping up. What do we know about e-scooters and injury outcomes? And so we do have, and I put it in the chat, an article in TRR that looked at all of the emergency department studies to date in late 2018, 19, that we could make some inferences from. So what do we really know about those injuries? That's where we're going to start, and then we're going to close out with some of the bigger picture. And one of the questions with that is, how can we understand this? How do we get this data? What's the best type of evidence? And this, when you have a new mode, particularly a really new mode, they don't have an ICD-10 9 or 10 code, which is the billing code for the hospitalization. And so we didn't have that prior to 2019-20, and that made it challenging. And part of the reason why we want to do this is because we want to know what the injury profile is if you're on the public health side, and you also want to know what the risk factors and contexts are if you're on the planning side or the transportation side. So we went through TRID, PubMed, Web of Science through November of 2019 and identified 18 emergency department studies, ED studies. Of those, there's kind of 3 types of studies, but I've lumped them into 2 right here. The first is a surveillance type of study, meaning that it captures every single incident that showed up at an emergency department in a region. And that's really important because we compare that with the vendor data and the studies about that John and Kristi are out there doing to get us an injury rate. And then we have 14 hospital level studies. Some of those look at every injury that walks through the door that's associated with an e-scooter. And some of those look at very specific injuries, say head trauma. And that gives us even a fuller picture of what the context is around e-scooter injuries. There are 4 surveillance studies, Alexandria, Auckland, Austin, and Portland. And I should say all 18 of these were English speaking studies. And we did pull from New Zealand and Australia because they were a little bit further ahead of their rollouts than we were. And what we know from these is that the amount of emergency department visits, when we looked at Auckland, Austin, and Portland, Alexandria didn't have quite enough information, is that we see about 20 to 24 emergency department visits per 100,000 trips. That's a really interesting thing to have. In fact, we don't always have that even with our other active modes because, or non-motorized modes, because we have both the numerator and the denominator. Auckland with their single payer system tells us something even more interesting though. For every 1 emergency department visit, there were an additional 2 visits to the primary care physician with an e-scooter injury. So we're only capturing maybe 1/3 of the most egregious injuries when we look at emergency department visits. The person who walks through the emergency department door is male. They're in their early 30s, and they probably were riding in the evening. But when we incorporated, again, that ridership demographic data as exposure, what we see is that women are about twice as likely as men in Portland to have an emergency department injury. And there, we could spend the rest of the time discussing why that might be, but it's just important to note. 30 to 60%, depending on studies, show a head or face injury, including up to 15% with a concussion or traumatic brain injury. Extremity fractures and dislocations are also quite common, with arms and wrists being the most typical. The context for the crash is that they're usually single person, fall off the scooter, run into a stationary object such as a curb event. But 10% or so are colliding with vehicles, and you do have a smattering of pedestrians who are injured by an e-scooter, or there's a pedestrian crash, which results in an e-scooter rider being injured. At least 33% of these visits resulted from a crash on a sidewalk. Only in Austin, which did follow-up interviews, only in Austin did we know anything about speed, where 37% said speed was a factor. They also said 19% they thought their e-scooter had malfunctioned. And you know, it's hard to know if it's new or whatnot. And that's a really great report because a lot of them were early rides, like first 5 rides. Very, very, very few documented helmet use, no more than 6% across all 13 studies, with Brisbane being an exception, where 44% wore their helmet, but they also have pretty stringent laws. And with that, we can see that it is protective against traumatic brain injury. Intoxication, night, and weekend rides are also pretty heavily in these injured populations. So I know that we are running really quick in time, so I'm going to just run through a couple of quick lessons and then tell you about the bigger picture. So you have this very brief window when you roll out a new technology, when there's a shared system where you can get vendor data. And so that's really important to how we did this study, because we could leverage that to get rates. But you also need a really cooperative health department. Much of the injury data is held, especially when it's something new and emerging. Just like COVID, we grabbed these e-scooter data in the States off of the emergent surveillance system. So cooperate and make friends with your health department. When we look at more broadly about health, what we know is transportation affects health through a couple ways, with physical activity being the vast majority, right? And then if we look at other mode shifts that aren't e-scooters, that air quality is about half of what your physical activity effect is, safety is like 1/10 of what your physical activity is, and then we have this like mobility, ability to get to health promoting destinations and activities also there. We care about physical activity, which is what I'm going to talk about for my last 3 or 4 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, because it prevents chronic disease, it prevents diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, stroke, even cancer and depression. Physical activity is all about time. You're supposed to get 30 minutes a day, but it can come in really small bouts. Even under 10 minutes is good. And the first 10 minutes are the most important. We measure it by knowing how high your heart rate is or how much you're moving. We want that moderate to vigorous physical activity, which can happen through even just walking, gets you to moderate. And most people do overestimate it. So we usually put on instrumentation like a heart rate monitor or an accelerometer to measure that. To answer the question specific to e-scooters, you have to really know 4 things. First, you have to know about this mode shift and substitution effect, which our previous 2 speakers spoke about at length. We have to know the trip distance and time on both the new mode and the old mode, because physical activity is really about time. We have to know, and one of the things that we don't know, as you'll see, is do e-scooter trips also include a walk to get to the e-scooter? In walk to transit trips, that's enough to get you 30 minutes a day. So if you want the e-scooters to be convenient, but maybe not too convenient, if it's a shared system, to maybe up that physical activity. And then we want to know the exertion levels. So we're going to go through these 4 things real quick and tell you where the state of the science is. First, the substitution, we just saw that, but most studies are showing there's a disproportionate substitution from active trips when you ask a self-reported question. Rebecca Sanders in a new 2022 paper suggests when you take the e-scooters away, at least down in Phoenix area, they actually took more cars. So that is still an open question as far as I am concerned. E-scooter distance and time is very similar to our walk to transit, walk and bike trips, both in distance and in time. So most trips are about that 1 mile on average. And when you look at the pilot data across all the different pilots, you're seeing about a 13 to 14 minute trip. How far will people walk to a shared e-scooter? This is a vastly understudied area, and the thing that I would need to know to give you a more quantitative idea about the physical activity benefits or risks of e-scooters. E-scooters are typically in that convenient place, and so they might not be walking at all, but we just don't know. And then finally, when I went to do this paper, this project, there was nothing out there on exertion. But Rebecca Sanders, and it's put down there in the notes, has a new paper out that shows it's very small. It's a very small pilot, but with a heartbeat monitor on, showed that e-scooters are performing like autos. And you want to be in that moderate to vigorous, the far to right columns, and we're just not there. So we really need to think about e-scooters in terms of physical activity, like they're a vehicle trip. So to summarize, on balance, e-scooters increase physical activity only if you're shifting from auto, right? And even then, it's very, very slight. And that's because the exertions may be slightly better, but there is a big time increase. All the rest of them, you're decreasing the exertion. So even if you're increasing the time, you're probably not getting a big public health benefit from physical activity. You may be getting or may not be getting a safety. You probably are getting an air quality benefit, although we could do a similar exercise for that. But the physical activity isn't that a stellar of a story, I'm sorry, to report. That said, whatever we can do to make a non-car dominated system probably helps all non-car modes, and those are huge physical activity things. And so I'm largely supportive of continuing to help micromobility grow. And with that, I think we're done, and we can do a couple of quick Q&As.
Great, thank you, Nicole and Kristi. And and so I just want to reiterate, this is, 3 different studies that NITC has funded related to scooters, all looking at different aspects of these kind of overarching questions around how are people using, e-scooters, and then what are the kind of social, environmental, and health related impacts as we kind of not transition, but add this new mode to our modal suites in cities. And so there, Nicole, there's a clarifying question around health data, and and I think this goes to this kind of bigger question about the IDC codes, about where we were and maybe where we're able to go and what we can learn more. But the question was related, well, how do we know these are transportation trips versus recreation trips as it relates to ER visits, and also kind of the issues around vehicle collisions versus a injury, a self-injury due to poor performance of utilizing the device.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the way that these early studies, all these emergency department visits are going is that they actually were drawing from the admission notes. It was literally keyword searching through that. And with that, and it was always during the very earliest part of the shared e-scooter system pilots, all 18 of those studies. So we're pretty convinced, because there's a lot of context in that note, in those notes, that all of those are e-scooters, not, you would take out mobility scooters, right? A wheelchairish scooter, and that they were for transportation trips and not just on a one wheel or whatever, messing around. And then now the ICD 9 and 10 codes that are available have very clear parameters around that. So they're pretty trustworthy as well.
So hopefully more information, more data on that as it relates to the crashes. And I think we should just kind of deal with the elephant in the room that all our studies didn't really deal with, which was COVID. Just real quickly, I want to highlight to everybody listening is that certainly my study ended in 2020. We didn't collect any data during the COVID. How did that affect travel behavior? So I guess the question to each of you, where how did our project change or would evolve, if there was, or how does COVID affect scooter usage, both safety and use of scooters?
Yeah, I'll hop in first. So, I mean, for me, it's all about mode substitution. And right now that is the big, huge question mark. And you and Kristi would probably be better suited to answer. I'll also say that the very people, it actually impacted me in this type of work in a very visceral research way, because the very people that we were relying upon to pull that public health data out of the emergency department notes were swamped with using that very same system for COVID. So only in places that had kind of established relationships was this type of work able to continue on the injury surveillance.
Yeah, and similarly, so our survey data was collected before the pandemic, our observations were sort of during. I think that a lot of the behaviors we saw in terms of like the rates of sidewalking use, those things are probably fairly consistent because the rates of traffic flow were similar. It wasn't empty streets that they were going on. There was a question about whether people were trying e-scooters to get away from maybe to substitute transit related trips. From what I can tell, that seems those kind of early concerns have sort of leveled off and stabilized. I'm more interested in people who maybe never would have ever tried e-scooters, and then all of a sudden they're introducing multimodal travel to their lives. But we don't have a lot of data about that. That's probably more qualitative information that we need to start capturing in really low level ways that are really hard to ask those questions on surveys. Anybody who's really interested in COVID related disruptions to travel should probably look at Deborah Salon from ASU, Giovanni Sorelli, who I think is in the University of California system, and both of them have been doing, Giovanni especially, ongoing surveys related to broader questions about travel disruption during the pandemic, which I think start to tease out some of those questions.
and I'll just add lastly is that, we're coming out of it. So there's a lot of kind of research that is coming to getting out there around how did COVID affect it, and how did people use it during COVID, and how to relate to transit. Now the question is, how do we come out of this? And what does it look like as we come? And part of it will be the industry. The industry has evolved and changed, and is, even before COVID. And now there's been consolidation, there's been bankruptcy, there's been, less scooters out there. So, there was a question related to, spatial distribution of scooters. Well, if we don't have as many scooters or as many different types of scooters within our cities, and it is very geographically different. So, what things look like here in Portland is very different than Tucson versus San Francisco or New York. And so, in how the industry kind of survives and kind of comes back into this will influence how people use it. Cost being a huge issue that I think will ultimately affect shared private shared micromobility is the cost. And so I think that will be a big issue to look at. Okay, so we've had a bunch of questions, around safety. I mean, related to, there was an individual worrying about people with vision impairment, and a lot of this kind of conflict on the in sidewalks. Kind of issues like, are we getting physical activity? Is this a negative? So how much does safety and physical activity, how do we weigh that against these kind of potential benefits that we're seeing, Kristi, from connection to transit or use of these low, emission devices for short trips? So how do we think about this?
Yeah, I think one area of study that I'm really kind of fascinated by is this idea of conflict analysis, and really looking at where we see the arguments happening. And one consistent theme that you kind of see in this sort of rhetoric is we're already, we have pedestrians and cyclists and now e-scooters, and sometimes, Amazon delivery trucks, all competing for the same sort of shared sidewalk and curb space. And that is a continuous sort of conflict. In our denser urban areas where there's a lot of activity happening, regardless, a lot of the big safety issues come around some of these conflicts and sort of where people feel safe moving. I think one area that would be really instrumental for practice is really thinking about how we weigh efficiency of travel and sort of what it means to be in a denser urban, and not prioritize the vehicle, because I think that might cause conflicts for people who want to be able to park at the next, whatever they want to do. But by and large, the biggest safety conflicts are in areas where there's just so much activity happening. There's so much space for very small sidewalks. But Nicole also has probably a lot of things.
I mean, that's where I go, and how I ended was, I don't think e-scooters are great for public health at large, but to the extent that they are part of the bigger package to shift away from vehicle all the time, and give more space to more alternative modes, all of which do better than e-scooters in terms of physical activity and safety, for the most part, I'm a fan, and both for greenhouse gas reduction and for the public health benefits. Right,
and I would concur in that. I think we need to think about mobility as a suite, right? So if we're really, the idea is reduce VMT and reduce single occupancy vehicle trips, we need more options to get more people comfortable about getting out of those devices, be it more transit, more micromobility. And what we saw in Portland is that some people that did not use bike share or did not bike were using scooters. So that is a positive thing. And then to minimize these public health issues, one, we should be promoting more safe places to ride, so we reduce those conflicts. Even taking more maybe space from cars, and so that people feel more comfortable using these different devices. More form factors of vehicles, so there's more seated scooters or other type of devices that maybe are safer for older adults to use. And then separation of from pedestrians and the like. So I guess I had the final word. I didn't want to have the final word. We're here at the end. It's 11 o'clock. Thank you everyone for participating. Kristi, Nicole, first of all, thank you for your great research. Second of all, any last comments, thoughts before we sign off?
Well, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to. There's so many active comments on the listserv. Please reach out if you have questions or if you'd like more information. Or and I'm sorry that we couldn't address all of them.
Likewise, it was a pleasure.
Thank you,
Bye.
John.
Great, thanks a lot, and thanks for coming, everyone. And be at our next one.
Thank you again, John.
Okay, bye.